First, I'd like to thank Chris Wimberg and Cecilia Jacobs for inviting me and bringing me to South Africa. Chris and Cecilia are really generous academics and really great people, so thank you both. It really is an honour to be here amongst you and a privilege to be asked. Before I go any further, I should say that this paper comes from research by myself, Sarah Howard and Eleanor Lambrinos, who are now all, as of Monday, members of the LCT Centre for Knowledge Building, which I'm dead chuffed about, because the university doesn't make it easy to do this sort of thing unless you bring millions and millions of dollars, and I can guarantee you that I brought about 10 bucks to the mix rather than 10 million, but they said yes anyway. So today I'm going to discuss how we can bring together different kinds of knowledge. It is, in fact, there's a number of quite a lot of new stuff in this talk, so I apologise for the fact that it's going to be I think it's about an hour and 3 minutes of me speaking, so you're going to get really bored of hearing me. But I didn't have time to be brief, as it were. I haven't honed this talk down yet, so sort of bed in, get comfortable. But I'm going to talk about how we can bring together different kinds of knowledge, an issue that pervades just about everything in education. And to explore that, I'm going to introduce and illustrate some concepts from an approach called legitimation code theory, or LCT for short, and I'll discuss specifically ideas that are relatively new in the form I'm going to discuss them, called autonomy codes, and I'll use them to analyse classroom practices. But I should emphasise up front that if the examples I'm going to use are a long way from your own research object of study or your own practice, don't let that trouble you, because the concepts are designed to be used on all kinds of practices at all levels of education in all kinds of social fields. And the main lessons I'll draw about knowledge building should be relevant no matter what your focus. So the paper has 4 main parts. I'll start by introducing the issue of bringing knowledge together, and I'll discuss several problems we have in addressing it. These problems stem from the kinds of theories we often use, which is why I'll then introduce concepts that overcome those limitations, the aforementioned autonomy codes from LCT. Thirdly, I'll illustrate their value by discussing a major project that uses those concepts to explore knowledge building in classrooms, and I'll focus on 3 examples from secondary school classrooms that take in the humanities, take in science teaching, and take in student presentations to show what counts as successful learning. And then finally, I'll discuss what lessons we can take from all this, for both the question of how to successfully integrate diverse or different forms of knowledge, and for the usefulness of these concepts more generally. I'm going to argue that we can use these ideas not only to show a key attribute of knowledge building, but also to teach students how to succeed, so they could potentially have a significant impact on social justice in education. So I'll start with a problem. Now, the problem of building knowledge from diverse sources is just about everywhere in education. In research, challenges like climate change are often described as wicked problems that require multidisciplinary expertise to resolve. And that raises the question of how we bring those diverse disciplines together productively. Among the challenges facing higher education is a diversified student population who are bringing a greater range of experiences with them. How do we relate those experiences to the diverse range of academic disciplines? Technology is said to be instigating huge changes in education. The key question there is, how do we successfully productively integrate technology within different kinds of educational practice? A key problem for vocational and professional education is bringing together academic knowledge and workplace experience. In fact, that issue is increasingly faced by educators from across the disciplinary map. How can we connect our teaching to students' working lives? So there are many, and there are many others, there are many areas of education where we're trying to bring together different forms of knowledge that may be fundamentally different. Yet many educational policies seem to suggest it's just a matter of kind of putting them next to each other and somehow they're going to be productive, like putting 2 panda bears together in an enclosure and you hope that you're going to get lots of little panda bears or something. So, for example, in Australia, universities are putting academics into new buildings where the offices have glass walls on the basis that the administrators believe that's going to magically make us collaborate. Or policies describe knowledge as if they're sticking them in a blender and just sort of turning it on. Now, there are many reasons these problems remain so intransigent, but I want to highlight two issues in particular. The first is well known by those of you who know LCT, which is knowledge blindness, or the fact that most education research can't see knowledge as an object. And that results at least partly from the ways that psychology and sociology have influenced education research in recent decades. And the influence of psychology on education research is to see the term knowledge, sort of define it as what goes on inside our heads, our minds. What I'm going to call knowing, just to distinguish it from what I'm going to talk about. So studies tend to focus on generic processes of learning, where what's being learned is not the central part of the picture. And the influence of sociology, which is where I come from on education research, is often to see knowledge as somebody's perspective, as just a reflection of power or dominant interest. So the focus is on the experiences of learners as categories of knowers. Now, both of those sorts of approaches see knowledge in terms of what one could call subjective knowledge, whether in the sense of mental processes or the expression of the subjective experiences of a particular social group. And that tends to see knowledge as an object in itself sidelined. What's being taught and learned, what's being argued, tends to be sidelined. So bringing together different forms of knowledge from these sorts of perspectives is either a matter of mindset, about being willing and flexible mentally. You might see, for example, articles in things like The Conversation online where they say 6 keys to successful multidisciplinary research, and they often tend to be things like, have a flexible and open mind and that sort of thing. Or it may be about comparative power amongst knowers, a question of who dominates whom. Now, of course, looking at knowing and looking at knowers are incredibly important. I'm not dismissing either of those, and I'm not saying the influences of these two great disciplines on education research are just negative and deleterious. But when they're the only way in which we see knowledge, it tends to mean that knowledge itself gets sidelined. And that makes the question of solving the problem of bringing together different forms of knowledge a bit difficult, because we're missing a key factor, namely the forms taken by knowledge and how they might interact. Our second problem is when we do discuss knowledge, models are often just descriptions of what knowledge is about. So, and by the way, when I say something is limited, I'm not a person who is interested at all in this argument where, because something has limits to it, everything has limits to it, because something has limits to it, we have to ditch it entirely. So I'm not saying these are terrible, I'm just trying to acknowledge where their limits might lie. For example, Schulman's pedagogical content knowledge and its elaboration in the TPAC model, both of which are really very useful, but not for what I'm trying to do here, because they tell us what the knowledge is about, but not the form it takes and how it might change. And the same holds for all sorts of types, like knowing of and knowing about, or knowing how and knowing that, and many, many other hard, soft, and so on. They're kind of useful to start with, but they have a limit. And the limit is that while they make intuitive sense and they can get you thinking, and that's very, very good, you'll struggle often with them as soon as you try to apply them to real-world empirical data, because nothing really fits neatly into these boxes. And the boxes themselves don't capture processes of change, either within each type or between types. The problem really is that we don't get with these at the organising principles underlying these categories. So, for example, if we take one of our most useful models for understanding this sort of thing, from Basil Bernstein, he described singulars, or subject areas that are strongly bounded and inward-looking, and regions that select and assemble content from a variety of those singulars to serve a field of practice beyond education. And those types are useful for making us think about things and for highlighting relations between, say, for example, academic knowledge and workplace knowledge, but they're static types. They can't describe differences between different kinds of singulars. Physics is not the same as philosophy. Or different kinds of regions. Law and hospitality studies have very different characteristics. And they cannot capture change between them, such as the process of taking ideas from disciplines and turning them to an outward purpose. In other words, they can't analyse what they describe. And that's true of all such types. So what we need then, really, I'm arguing anyway, is to see knowledge as an object, but also to conceptualise the organising principles underlying knowledge practices, so we can see what's different or the same and explore changes over time. Our concepts need to be applicable in empirical research, and what's more, research into all kinds of practices so that we can embrace a great range of phenomenon. And we need to do that so we get at both what's generic and what's specific, so we don't end up with either, on the one hand, a kind of one-size-fits-all approach that sees everything as generic and fails to account for differences, or on the other hand, a sort of series of context-dependent, very segmented models or bags of tricks that don't build on each other. And that is what legitimation code theory, for those who don't know it, tries to, or LCT aims to generate. So a means of getting at the organising principles of practices, a means of trying to get at the DNA of knowledge, or DNA of knowledge practices. And it extends and integrates insights for a whole range of approaches, most centrally and most explicitly Borges' field theory and Bernstein's code theory. And it basically offers a conceptual toolkit, one built from and for empirical research. It's all forged within and used for empirical research. And there's a fast-growing body of work using the framework. Last time I checked, it's something like 150 publications and 370 odd papers and 80 PhDs, which isn't bad since it's only the very first paper published using any of these concepts was only in 2000. And it's used in teaching such as academic literacy and academic development programs, as well as shaping curriculum design in subjects as different as engineering and youth work. And there's an amazing conference next year, which I'll return to after my talk. And they're designed, the concepts, to explore all kinds of educational sites from preschool to university, all kinds of practices, research, curriculum, pedagogy, so on, across the disciplinary map from physics to ballet, as well as other fields such as museums, law, the armed services, prison education. And this holds the concepts I'm going to introduce today. I'm going to use examples from secondary school classrooms, because this comes from a major project on that, but they can be used for all kinds of practices. I just want to let you know, I'm not going to go into detail, let you know that there is a whole sociological approach behind LCT. There's an account of society, just so you know it's there, an account of society is a series of relatively autonomous social fields of practice where actors cooperate and struggle for the status and resources of that field, and an account of practice as involving languages of legitimation. In other words, our practices are also can be understood as messages about what is or is not legitimate. And they're the basis of these struggles for status. Everyone's trying to make what defines them into the definition of success in the field. There's a whole sociological approach behind this, but I'm not going to mention that. I'm going to just mention that it's a multi-dimensional framework with a set of tools, which, just to put you off, in a very abstract format, looks like that. Just so you think I'm going to really confuse you. But it's basically a toolkit, and people use different parts of the toolkit for solving different problems. And I'm only going to focus on one small part of the toolkit and how it can be useful for research into this issue of bringing things together, and it's called autonomy. And autonomy begins from the very simple premise that any set of practices or ideas is made up of constituents that are arranged in a particular way. It's as simple as that. In other words, a set of practices comprises positions, whether these are actors or ideas or objects or whatever it might be, and principles, or the ways those things are organised, their ways of working, their aims, their purposes, and so on. So that sets up two relations, which we call positional autonomy, or the relations between positions within a context and positions from outside it. And did I say positional autonomy? Yes, I thought I said relational for some reason. And relational autonomy, good, between the principles within that context and from elsewhere. So between positions, the things in it and elsewhere, and the ways of their arranged, what they're for, and elsewhere. And each can be stronger or weaker, where stronger represents sort of greater insulation, greater strength of boundaries and control, and weaker represents lesser insulation. So if a practice effectively says there should be stronger boundaries between what's in this context and what lies beyond it, that's stronger positional autonomy, or PA. And if it effectively announces there should be stronger boundaries between how we do things here and how they're done elsewhere, that's stronger relational autonomy. But very simply, we can ask where things are coming from and where the purpose to which they're being used come from. So we can describe a continuum of strengths of positional autonomy, from weaker to stronger, and a continuum of strengths of relational autonomy, from weaker to stronger, on a Cartesian plane as they're called, and that will give us 4 main autonomy codes. And I'll just walk you through what they are before I start using them. So, sovereign codes, and don't worry, I'm going to use these over and over again, so you'll get it in the end. Sovereign codes are where positional autonomy and relational autonomy are both pretty strong. So the basis of achievement or status is strongly insulated positions and autonomous principles. In other words, this emphasizes the specific, the intrinsic, that which is from within and oriented to within. In other words, what matters is using stuff from inside and for inside purposes. Basically, the motto of sovereign codes are, home is where the heart is, or better still, my heart lies at home. For example, I said this part of the talk would define the concepts in order to introduce the theory I'm using. I'm discussing the concepts right now, so I'm showing stronger positional autonomy, and I'm using that knowledge to introduce the theory, so I'm exhibiting stronger relational autonomy. I'm talking right now in the sovereign code. Exotic codes are the opposite. Practices are characterized by weaker positional autonomy and weaker relational autonomy. So they draw on practices from elsewhere and they put them to other purposes. The motto of exotic codes would be status lies abroad or overseas or elsewhere or whatever. For example, I'm terribly upset that Van Gaal is still Manchester United manager. It's really heartbreaking for me. That's not content on LCT concepts. And when I was saying it, I wasn't using it to introduce any theory, so I was just in the exotic code. Roman codes are where practices have weakly insulated positions and they're being used. So they're using materials or practices from outside, but they're using them from purposes that come from inside. So it's named after the expression, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. So the motto here is that even if something comes from elsewhere, when in Rome, it will do as the Romans do. So you're bringing things in from outside and turning those things to their own purposes. For example, I just used the everyday expression, when in Rome. So I'm using what I'm saying to illustrate these things. I'm moving around the plane as I speak. Well, I just used the everyday expression, when in Rome, do as the Roman do, and I just turned it to the purpose of introducing those concepts. So I've just been in the Roman code. And the Trojan code is the other way round. So what you're doing comes from within, but you're using it for purposes from outside. Here, practices dance to a tune from outside. They're inside the city walls, but they're being used for something else. So, for example, if I start using these concepts, these two in particular, to start making jokes, such as maybe I watched way too many of these ancient history lessons when I was naming these codes, I'd be talking about the concepts, so it'd be stronger positional autonomy, but I'd be doing so in a way to try and generate some sort of rapport with you through using humour. So I'd be in the Trojan code right then. So there's plenty of real world examples coming, so don't worry if that didn't make any sense or you can't. I'll be using them again and again to actually see what they can do, until such time as you can't actually think of anything else. I should say here that the simple descriptions can sound like binaries. I'm saying inside and outside, but they're not binaries. I'm saying that as a simple way in. Even at the most basic level, if something comes from inside, you can ask, is it an essential part? Is it a part of the core or the peripheral inside? Or if it's from the outside, is it from nearby or far away? These really are continuum. They're not dichotomous. So we can have a typology of principal codes, these 4, but also an infinite topology, the plane itself. We can have positions everywhere. So we can analyse practices such as parts of a lesson. Say each one of these is, I don't know, something happening, or maybe a book, or it may be a person, or it could be anything. And we can analyse and put them all on the plane, and we can see in this case it's dominated by one code. But there are examples from other codes. It's not a box. And we might look at another lesson, or another discipline, or another time, and then we can compare those two and see which ones are the dominant codes. And so we can start seeing the differences between things, or whether they may overlap. What we're going to do today, though, is something called tracking. We can track autonomy pathways. Tracking is where you follow the movements from code to code to see the pathways they set up. So this might be one. They're moving from sovereign to exotic, and then they move to Roman, then they go up there, and then they go across. That's quite a complex path. Or they might be just a simple path. They go from that one to that one, and then out to there. Now these concepts can be applied on anything. To do tracking on any particular object of study, we have to say what these rather abstract sounding things look like in a specific context with a particular set of data. Each code looks very different in different practices. Now in the project I'll be discussing, our particular object of study is classroom practice in secondary schools. We're exploring the basis of selection, assembly and enactment of knowledge in classrooms. We're looking at the pedagogizing of knowledge. So we're concerned with where knowledge comes from. Is it from the subject area, by which we simply mean whatever they're supposed to be teaching and learning? I'll get on to how we decide that in a moment. Or does it come from somewhere else? And we're concerned with the uses of that knowledge. Is it for teaching and learning that subject area or for something else? So this is a really simple version of what I'm going to look at. I've filled it in with history. So if it's history content that's being discussed in the classroom, in our examples, it'll be, it's content from the history curriculum. It'll be in the top half somewhere. It'll be stronger positional autonomy. If it's from somewhere else, wherever that might be, it'll be in the bottom half. If it's being used for the purpose of learning the history, it'll be in the right-hand side. Stronger relational autonomy. It's being used for something else on the weaker. You following? And we use combinations of those codes of those things to generate the codes and then track the lessons across the plane. For those who are interested, I'm talking to an audience that comes from people who are very, very immersed in LC2 to people who are in the wrong room because they thought it was something else, like TLC or something. For those who are interested in LC2, we created a translation device for enacting these concepts in our data so that we could always allocate things into strengths without it being any kind of subjective, there's always subjective cross judgment, but we didn't just make it up. So we developed a translation device for being able to allocate things to strengths along the continuum. And we used this, and then we tried to crash test it on everything, on research, and not just classroom practice, on analysis of dinner parties. We even did an analysis of a comedy sketch that explains why it's funny, when it's funny, using autonomy codes to see if we could break the translation device and see if we could break the codes. So we've tried it out a lot. This simply describes stronger autonomy as target knowledge or practice. Target, which simply means whatever you are supposed to be, whatever you say. To define that category, we didn't say this is what history should be, or this is what science should be. We asked the history teachers, we asked the science teachers, and they defined their intended content, their intended purposes according to the state curriculum. So in this case, their target is shown by the key learning areas of the curriculum, because that's the way they defined their target knowledge, their target purposes, what they aim to do. That's their stronger, that's their insight, effectively. And everything else is non-target. And I'm just showing you this so you can see that it isn't just binaries. We went actually to 3 levels of distinctions, but we defined things that were really inside, which teachers sort of defined in terms of a very specific, that unit they're teaching right then and there. And any other part of history from other topics or other years was, yes, still part of what they want to do, but not quite as core. So we called that just double plus and plus. And then stuff that's not what their target is, but it's nearby, other school, like school geography or history from university or something, and then knowledge from far beyond the curriculum, so for everyday knowledge, for example. So I should emphasize, you don't need to understand this at all to follow my examples. I just told you here so that in case you might be interested in how the concepts can be activated and to show that we have definite criteria for assigning data to our codes, that then other people can try it out on their own data. It's not just our interpretation of what should be history, what should be science, or whatever we're studying. With these tools, you take the definitions of those people that we took the definitions of the people we were studying and analysed their practices in relation to their aims. Now, the analyses I'll discuss come from the PEAK project, a major study of secondary schooling run by myself, Sarah Howard and Jim Martin, and we're looking at whole units of study in science and humanities subjects through years 7, 8 and 9, the first 3 years of secondary school. And we're collecting data from 3 schools with very different profiles of socio-economic status, or SES. We video each unit, it's about 6 to 8 hours of lessons each unit, and we analyse it every second using 4 legitimation codes and some new concepts. And I'm going to focus on history and science in Year 7. The first year students are apprenticed in disciplinary subjects. And I'm going to discuss, as I said, 3 examples: bringing geography into history, using maths in science lessons, and then some student presentations which are going to show us something different. And I'm going to tell you my big take-home message for the entire paper at the end of this first one. So you can get a sense of what I'm talking about first, and then you can see it in action again. So our first example, I'm going to actually use a couple of video clips in the first example, which horrifies me. I don't like relying on technology like this, but I thought it might make a nice change from listening to me for a whole hour. And it's also, because I'm just so multimodal. And in this first video clip, they're only about a couple of minutes long each. The teacher, and then I'm going to walk through it. The teacher's discussing the Roman Empire, and she's bringing in geographic knowledge, such as Rome being on a river, and she uses an analogy from everyday knowledge, everyday life, about how Italy looks like a boot. And as you'll see, neither the geographic knowledge or the everyday kind of analogy end up being very well integrated, and she ends up not teaching the history that she wants to at all. So I'll see how we go. Tell me if it needs to be louder, right?
Okay. This tells us that the Romans, the people who are from Rome, they didn't just have one city. It expanded, the places where they lived expanded, and they had a whole empire, which means a huge area of land where they spread out and they owned it all and they lived. Okay? So, this is now modern. Not ancient, but modern. This is Rome, the city, and this whole country is Italy, the country. So the capital city is Rome, like our capital city is Canberra, and this whole country is coloured in orange. If you see the map I just put on your desk, this side, you can see they've written Italia, because that's how the Italians say the name of their country, right? Italia. It's Italy, right? Shh. That's Italy. And you can know Italy. Does anyone already know this? Italy is easy to spot because it's the shape of something. Yes, a boot. See how this is a lady's high heel boot? There's the high heel, there's the toe, and it's a big long boot. Can everyone see that? Yeah? Okay.
What's the top there?
I don't know, just pretend. Up until there it's a boot. So the city is Rome, but now in modern day the whole country is Italy. Do you get it? Okay. But we're talking about ancient Rome.
Yes.
Now, the city of Rome has always been in the same place, and it's along the river. But where was the Roman Empire? Look at this, it's massive. Here's Italy with the boot, but all of the red parts were owned by the Romans.
Whoa.
And their headquarters, their capital or their headquarters was in Rome, but they owned all the red.
Oh my God.
What might be confusing with this map? The white sections on your map are land. The dark sections are water. Okay, so you found it? Okay. Alright, what were you going to say? Yeah?
Okay, so she began by talking about the Romans and showing the students two maps. As you heard, she talks about the Romans, how they expanded where they lived and their empire and so on. She's beginning very much in the sovereign code. This is history content as defined by New South Wales Board of Study. It's for the purpose of learning history. But then, as you saw, she begins to weaken autonomy by talking about the capital city being like Canberra in Australia, and describing the name of the modern country of Italy in Italian. And we're outside secondary school history now. We could be in geography, so we're not too far into the exotic code. But then she really weakens both positional and relational autonomy by talking about how to spot Italy on a map because it looks like a boot. That's not history knowledge. It's not for the purpose of learning history. So what the curriculum says is history. So it's quite far outside secondary school knowledge, so we're at least on the cusp of double minus territory. Now, I need to make really clear at this point, before I go any further, there is nothing wrong with that. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I inherited pluses and minuses from Bernstein. I hate them, because sometimes people think that plus is good, minus is bad. Nothing like that exists in LCT. It just doesn't come in. Minus can be good in many ways, plus can be bad in many ways. There's nothing wrong with that. Drawing on everyday knowledge that helps engage the students, gives them a way into complex ideas. But the question is how such everyday knowledge gets used in classrooms. In this case, the teacher keeps going further and further by discussing the boot more and more. It's a lady's high heel boot, there's the high heel, there's the toe, what's the top part of the map, not really sure, just up to there is the boot and so on. She keeps moving deeper and deeper into the exotic code. Again, there's actually nothing wrong with that in itself, unlike some. We don't argue that everyday knowledge is bad and academic knowledge is good and one's powerless and one's powerful. Everyday knowledge can be incredibly powerful and be really powerful in the classroom in helping students understand the academic knowledge as well. But here the teacher has made it hard to get back to teaching what she wants to do, either the geography bit or the history bit. It's hard to get back to where she wants to be, which she says is students learning history. She tries to get them back there by changing the content to strengthen the positional autonomy and turning it back to the purpose. She talks about how the city of Rome has always been in the same place in a river, and she asks students where the Roman Empire was and so on. And there's way more than I've put on this slide, but it's a long way back to travel to either geography or history, and she ends up with a student, I don't know if you can hear it right at the end, the student asking, "Miss, that was a boot?" That wasn't inevitable. One way of getting back is what I call a hard reset, wiping the plane clean, and starting again in the sovereign code. It's usually indicated, we find, by teachers saying things like, "So," or "all right," or "okay now," and then resetting the activity back on task as they define it. But she didn't hear. So they end up quite a long time. I'm not going to show you this. We do the analysis so you don't have to sit through it. Quite a long time talking about boots. Something she never intended them to be learning in this lesson. And indeed, if you watch the rest of the unit, all 8 hours of it, you'd find the students learn only common sense understandings with very little relation to secondary school history. So they might learn that Rome is the capital of Italy, but that's not part of the actual curriculum. That's not part of the understanding of the Roman Empire. Okay, let's compare that example to a strategist of a different teacher. My final... Oh, I hate video clips. But still, you know, got to move into the 21st century and all that.
So parents are basically people take over. Yeah? And it's an interesting thing to consider that they have this range. Now, remember we talked about a number of the Greek states. Now, we talked about, we mentioned Corinth, if we were thinking of looking at our map. We mentioned Corinth. And then we maybe should think about where Thessaly is. Thessaly, so maybe you might want to write that down in pencil, but remember to try and go home and try and find. Thessaly. Samos. Oops. Samos. And maybe just imagine as well. Oops. Have you already put it on, have you? Yeah. That's Samos, S-A-M-O-S. You'll have to go home and find them. No, we're just saying names, we know where they are. Because how do you know who's allies with whom and who's fighting with whom and why they're fighting with each other? Unless you know where they are. And, you know, maybe we should consider and look where Persia is, where we have the Persian king. So maybe, isn't Persia over there?
I like where that video clip ends. So she starts, this is at Lauder School. Hunt is, oh, what's happening here? Oh, I can't see it somewhere. Hunt is I just have to... What on earth? I can't see what it's saying. But anyway, okay, Hunt is at... So no, we're at history at Lauder. Okay, so she begins the clip with the teachers discussing the content from the secondary school history for the purpose of learning history. And then she sounds like she's going to take that knowledge and weaken its autonomy. She says where they should think about where Thessaly is on the map, and they need to find places they've been discussing. So that sounds as if she's weakening positional autonomy. She might be bringing in, she may be going down, she might be bringing in some geographic knowledge, where those places are, and she emphasises they've got to know where they are. It sounds as if she might be going leftwards, weakening the relational autonomy, taking the history knowledge and using it for learning something else. She might be just about to go left or down, or even both, going into the exotic code like the previous example. But she doesn't do any of those. She explains why they need to know where the places are, why it is historical knowledge, and what its purpose is in learning history. They need to know who is allies with whom. They need to know it in order to know who is allies with whom, who's fighting with whom, and why. And this is something she's been discussing at length before that little tiny segment, and something she returns to regularly through the lessons. It's a regular theme that where people are shapes their relations, their international relations, and therefore helps explain historical events. So even if she does move a little down or towards other kinds of knowledge and across to other purposes, she strengthens at that point the autonomy again by explaining its purpose for learning history. So in this case, she doesn't actually leave the sovereign code. Now, again, I should emphasise a caveat here. Staying in the sovereign code isn't the answer, because that could have negative effects. If she remained there for all 6 to 8 hours of this unit and further on, it would become very abstract and very disconnected from students' experiences. It could become too closely allied to a curriculum, never leaving ancient history, which wouldn't give many ways in for all the students. But this teacher doesn't do that. She regularly leaves the sovereign code. So, for example, here she's discussing the fact that the main job of men in Sparta, or Spartiates, was being a soldier. We're in the sovereign code. She talks about how archaeology has shown new things about Sparta. She says, now there's a lot of new research that shows some Spartiates may have had other jobs. The new research comes from archaeology. They've dug down deeper and found things like an oven kiln inside Sparta. So she's weakening positional autonomy. She's using knowledge from elsewhere, in this case archaeology, but it's still for the purpose of learning history. So the RA, the relational autonomy, is still strong. So she's gone down into the Roman code. And then she moves very quickly back up into, she brings this home by saying what that knowledge means for what they're learning. She turns that into historical knowledge. She says, now if only Spartiates can live inside the walls of Sparta, that means they must have been doing something else. They must have been making pottery. So that's one of the ways we get new research in ancient history. So this teacher doesn't say stuck in one code. Indeed, she regularly moves to everyday knowledge. She regularly moves too far into the exotic code. For example, she moves from a discussion of government in Sparta, which is a key part of the unit they're learning, to students' modern day understanding of elections in there we go, I can now see my slides again. She moves to a modern day understanding of elections in Australia, and then she converts that knowledge. She puts it to use by saying how the examples are related to what they're learning about history. She gets them to imagine what a Spartan would make of standing in a booth and making a mark with a pencil to vote, because the Spartans voted by clapping. And then she shifts it back into the history knowledge by discussing how decisions were made in Sparta in comparison. So she goes out, she engages with the students' existing everyday non-academic knowledge, she turns that into something of use in learning the history they're focused on, and then she comes back home to continue talking about the thing that she wishes to talk about, the stuff about Spartan government. Now students do in Lauder School, which is a higher SES school, they do try to seize on moments of exotic code, just like they do in the other one on Boot, but and then start just having fun and not going back to the history. But when they do try to stay in the exotic code too long for her liking, she does a hard reset and reestablishes the purpose of what they're discussing. She brings everyone back on task. She ramps up, she strengthens relational autonomy by talking about saying things like, So we're doing this to learn about government in Sparta, just ramping up the purpose. And then she strengthens the positional autonomy by saying with more history content, such as elaborating on what they're meant to be learning. So in her teaching, she's always circulating, this teacher. She's either inside the sovereign code or she's across the plane, she's moving around, but she's always coming back to where she started in the sovereign code, to what they're supposed to be doing according to her, learning secondary school history. So this is the simple take-home message of the talk, which I'll go on to do a couple more times until you beg me to stop, which is that to integrate and build knowledge, you need to travel. It's not enough to stay confined at home inside your specific set of knowledge and ways of working. You need to engage with different content and or different purposes to which the content can be put. In other words, you need to weaken positional autonomy and relational autonomy. You need to get out your sovereign code, leave your sovereign code. But you need to take what you learn on your travels and bring those lessons home, or you won't build knowledge in the way that you want. You need to connect that content up with what your content is, or what your practices are. You need to turn it to the purposes you're aiming for, whatever they may be. In short, you need to take yourself or your readers or your students or whatever it might be on autonomy tours. And there's a Cape Town. Couldn't find one for Stellenbosch. So in the examples I've shown so far, the first teacher toured but couldn't get back home again, and she did that regularly. And the second one travels but returns back to her stated aims. And there's another lesson from this analysis based on the simple notion that the more codes you master, the more that you can do with knowledge. Having more codes under your belt, having more experience of more codes is like knowing more languages or being able to play more sports well. We analysed every second of these entire units for autonomy codes. In the Hunt School, the lower SES school, they spent almost their entire time outside history. That's 93% of their time outside history, doing things for other purposes, mostly for learning generic study skills. Not only do these students learn almost no history, it's a history class, they also effectively experienced only one code. In the Lauder School, they spent 2/3 of their time in engaging with history content to learn history, but they also spent time in other codes. So these students experienced other ways of engaging with knowledge, bringing things from elsewhere, going outside, staying outside, coming back in again. And the Lauder teacher travelled along autonomy paths that went, for example, into the exotic, back through the Roman, into the sovereign is the example I gave you, turning that outside knowledge towards target purposes and then connecting it back up to target knowledge. She's modelling how to weave different kinds of knowledges together. So in these two schools, we've got one set of students living outside where they're meant to be, and the others touring and bringing back what they've learned, enriching their understanding of history. I should add, by the way, though, this isn't just a function of the secondary school and the fact that one's very low SES and one's very high SES, because now we've got a Year 8 teacher at Hunt School who took over many of the same students, and he is amazing at autonomy tours. So it seems to be, from what we're analysing in Year 8, same school, same kids, different teacher. It's the teacher's practice that can matter. It's whether he takes them, for example, on autonomy tours. Okay, so let's move to science. I'll discuss science lessons in which students are doing mathematics. I'm going to use Lauder School again, but I'm going to compare it to Andretti School, which is more of a middle-range social population, simply for the reason, not because I'm cherry-picking, but simply for the reason that the Hunt School science, there was no science whatsoever. That was a very painful 8 hours of watching. There was almost nothing to analyse. I'll begin with Lauder School first. This teacher is a former research scientist. We analysed 6 of her lessons, so about 6 hours. We have so many analyses, we'll be writing papers forever. This is a series of lessons that explain why the Earth has seasons. It begins with a practical experiment that is intended to show that light striking at different angles causes different degrees of heating in an object, and the teacher's now getting the students to turn their results of their practical experiment into a graph. They wrote the experiment results into a table. We're going to turn that into a graph, then they're going to go and discuss and build on to start understanding the complex issue of why the Earth has seasons. I'm going to discuss something that covers about 15 minutes of lesson time, so I'm not going to show a video. I'm going to walk you through the autonomy pathway the teacher takes through this activity. So this phase of the lesson begins with the teacher reminding the students of a table into which they wrote the results of their experiment. So we're starting with scientific knowledge, and it's for scientific purposes. She states, we are going to graph, which hits at least 3 entries in the New South Wales Board of Studies syllabus for Stage 4 science. using, for example, using range of representations to organise data, applying simple numerical procedures. We are definitely in the sovereign code here. She then gets to think about the rules of graphing. Remind me about the rules of graphing. And that moves into a discussion of knowledge from secondary school mathematics. X versus Y, independent and dependent variables, where they go on the graph. These ideas are regularly used in science classrooms, but they are not in the science curriculum that we're looking at. So in our case, I'm never saying anything about anywhere else. In our case, they're from secondary school mathematics. She's gone PA-, she's gone outside the curriculum, and at first she's recounting them just for understanding the rules of graphing, so it's for the purpose of the maths. She's gone into an exotic code. But then she says, now in this experiment, which signals a change in purpose to from discussing maths for maths, she strengthens relational autonomy, she turns it to learning the science, and that discussion of what they're going to do with that X, Y, independent, dependent variable graphing stuff goes on for some minutes. She talks about how to turn their figures into a graph using colours and symbols, and where their variables of minutes and temperature and angle should all go. The problem happens, though, in this case, is the students keep running into trouble. They keep saying they've only had a brief mention of graphing knowledge, and they're trying to turn that to scientific purposes, and they keep saying things like, "I'm confused." We keep, it's in you watch the videos. "I'm confused. I don't know what to do." And the teacher, after a couple of minutes, begins to realise that they don't have the math skills to turn to scientific purposes, because their experiment actually is more, it's not because of a lack of them, it's their experiment is more complicated than their mathematical knowledge. As she highlights in the quote on the slide, we've got 3 sets of data. This one's going to break the rules of graphing a bit. They've got 3 sets of data to graph. So they can't do this Roman code that she's asking them to do, of using their maths knowledge for doing science, because their maths knowledge isn't good enough at this point for doing that science. So she shifts autonomy code. She goes back. She goes back to doing entirely maths knowledge just to learn the maths. So she moves to the exotic code and she spends quite a few minutes teaching them straight maths content to learn graphing. She weakens the relational autonomy, moving them left on the plane. She makes it very clear it's now not about science. She tells the students, for example, not to worry about things like missing data, which if you saw this teacher, you'd realise she's really big on consistency. She's very scientific. And suddenly she's saying, don't worry about that, just, borrow some data from somewhere else. It's not very scientific, but it'll help you finish drawing the graph. And similarly, another student says their data is bad, and she says, doesn't matter, we're just going to plot them. We're practicing graphing now. And then she walks the students through the basic plotting of a graph from the ground up, what it involves, where it goes, and so on. And then having done that, the students are then able to turn that maths knowledge to the purpose of doing the science, transforming their table of results into graphs. And this move is helped by the teacher giving the explanation of the purpose of what they've just learned. She says, okay, so this is a better way of presenting the data than it is to look at a table. Graphs help us to see better what the trend is. Straight away when you look at this graph, you see which one has increased in temperature fastest. And then finally, she brings it all home, strengthening positional autonomy with some science content. They've drawn their graphs, and now they have to write a conclusion based on their results, interpreting their graph in terms of a hypothesis, a prediction they'd made before their practical experiment. Now, in conversation, Basil Bernstein used to say that classrooms are the graveyard of the researcher, because it's so bloody complex. The classroom is so complex that you never come out from trying to analyse it. And that's quite a complex pathway. I mean, for 15 minutes you would expect it to be. But we can actually follow that. We can say that she went from science for science, science content for learning science. She tried to use some maths knowledge, bring that in. She tried to turn it to a science use. It failed because the maths knowledge they had was too simple for the complex nature of the task. She went back. She did the maths for teaching those maths skills, armoured with those things, now laden with those. They're ready. They go back. They try it again. They go back into the Roman code, use the maths for science purposes, and then she brings it back to relate to their hypothesis they'd made before their experiment. So she took them on an autonomy tour before then bringing home those lessons to learn science. Let's compare that to another teacher from Andretti. He's teaching about the solar system. They previously worked out some distances between planets. Now they're working out relative distances. They're meant to draw a table. This is sovereign code, we could say. We can be nice and generous about it. It's part of the curriculum, just like the first thing. They've previously worked out, But the thing is, being in the sovereign code is no guarantee of anything. It's not it's not the answer. It's not the answer to anything. The sovereign code by itself is not the silver bullet. Because unlike the previous school, the Lauder school, he gives no reason for why the students are there. They've just watched a video showing the relative scales of everything from a Planck, a minuscule measurement, up to the size of the known galaxy, that he said was, and I'm quoting, to show how insignificant we are. Existential angst isn't part of the secondary school science curriculum. So we've just appeared in this code. We've had no run-up. He's not building on any previous knowledge, unlike the previous example. And this becomes a problem when he tries to bring maths knowledge in, because there's no science purpose to which he can hitch that maths content. This is the table he gives them. It's a bit hard to see. It has the sun and planets as rows, and as columns it has radius, distance from the sun, and he's added in pen, marker pen, on the right-hand side, 2 columns, diameters as percentage of Earth and distance as percentage of Earth. And it's those columns he wants them to figure out. And when he talks about it, he refers to it repeatedly as information. That wasn't stuff about the planets. That's just information, and says they're going to do some maths. Can you copy down this information? We've already got the information. We're going to do some maths. But it's not maths for learning or doing science. He's jumped to an exotic code. It's maths content, presumably for maths purposes. I'm not really sure what the purpose is. He talks for several minutes, mostly pointing to columns and saying they need to write the numbers down, followed by another 5 minutes of saying they need to calculate the radius and the diameter. Not how to do so, but that they need to. So he's got the students sort of hanging out in the exotic code, and he's not really teaching them any maths. And when he does try to explain how to calculate sizes relative to the size of the Earth, he kind of just says that and then refuses to do it and to model it, to fill it out himself. Unsurprisingly, so we're outside science, but we're not really in maths either. Unsurprisingly, the students become a bit increasingly distracted. One asks about strings, which is something from the video they've seen. A string is this tiny little thing. And what's smaller than a string? Oh, I don't know, it says. Didn't you look in the video? And another asks, are we made of star stuff? It's kind of cute, really. He goes, what do you think? And we continue drifting away. And when he does bring it back, it's again to maths. He says, so you know what you need to be doing? All right, the formula is up there, so you divide the distance. Where's your diameter? That one by Earth's diameter, which is that one, is pointing to things on the board, and times it by 100, and you do it with every single one. Always divide it by Earth, and that will give you a percentage. And it's really obvious from that the mention of Earth is completely arbitrary. This isn't science. This is just, it could be anything. This could be balls or anything. Students are now calculating percentages on something completely arbitrary. So while the Lauder teacher is teaching maths and then applying it to learning science, working in the exotic and then moving to the Roman code, this teacher is having the students sort of hang out in the exotic code somewhere. Time passes. 25 minutes later. So we're now 25 minutes from the start of where I started. 25, by the way, 25 minutes is 11 minutes longer than the entire graphing activity in Lauder. He asks what the numbers mean to us. What do these numbers actually mean to us? This is an opportunity to strengthen relational autonomy, to strengthen the purpose. Right from using the maths for learning, using the maths just for calculation, to using it for learning science. What do these numbers mean to us? He can plug that back in to the world that they're supposed to be learning about. Something about the solar system, which is what the unit is meant to be on. A student answers a lot of numbers, which is just about right, really, because the teacher's answer is to then call out the numbers that should fill the columns, the cells of the columns. After 40 minutes, after 40 minutes of this, a student says, this is hard, and the teacher says, that's maths. We still need to do maths and science, but it's not maths and science, I don't think. I don't think it's even maths, really. It may be maths, I suppose, but it's not maths in science. It's not maths for science. And he ends the entire task before moving on to another activity in a phase of the lesson absolutely perfectly. He ends by saying, I know it's confusing, which had us all in hysterics when we reached that point. This is not really an autonomy tour. This is a one-way trip out of science through maths to, well, I don't know where they end up. I really don't. He says repeatedly they're doing some maths and it's needed for science, but he doesn't teach any maths and he doesn't turn it to learn any science. And unlike the previous example where the maths was taught, and this, by the way, I didn't pick this because it's unusual. This is very not unusual. It's a double negative, but you know what I mean? It's quite frequently found in our data. So the maths isn't taught and turned to science purposes and then the whole activity plugged back into a bigger picture of learning about seasons, or learning, that's the previous one, or learning about the solar system. This is separate from what came before and it's separate from what came after. This activity becomes completely segmented from everything else. So I've argued we need to take autonomy tours to reach out to different kinds of knowledge and bring those lessons back home, but does it matter how we do this? I've shown you different ones. Are some more pathways valued more than others? I want to suggest that autonomy tours are a generic feature of knowledge building using diverse sources, but the specific subjects, specific tasks, specific years of study all have their own distinctive pathways. They take different routes. For those who know semantics from LCT, this is the equivalent of saying all subjects value semantic waves, but those waves have different heights, different lengths, different durations, start in different places, and so on. To illustrate what I mean, I'm going to show you a particular pathway that was valued in our science lessons. I'll briefly discuss student presentations from Lauder School. These come at the end of the unit. You already saw, I already discussed a bit of this. It comes at the end of the unit after 4 lessons jam-packed with knowledge about why the Earth has seasons, which is not simple, by the way. Why the Earth has seasons is incredibly difficult, implication complex to understand. It involves a lot of scientific knowledge about tilt, rotation, angles, and a lot more. These students have learnt about it, then they've tried that knowledge out on other planets with different tilts, different rotations and so on, different orbits such as Mars and Uranus. And then at the end of the unit, the teacher is giving them this assignment that they do to demonstrate their understanding. The next 2 slides are word for word from her slides. She puts this up on a slide. Newsflash. Ocean levels have been on the slow and steady rise, but due to drastic and rapid climate change, the South Pole is melting even faster now, super fast, like an ice cube on hot pavement. You believe that because of this, the Earth is going to be unevenly weighted and it will start to tip over. You have discovered that Earth's tilt to 23.5 degrees is changing. In fact, it is increasing and quickly. Currently, it is 28.5 degrees and changing. You know that this means significant changes to our seasonal cycle, days and nights, climate and other aspects of life on Earth. And this is the content of her next slide. They're scientists. The students are going to have to be scientists, and their task is to present their findings to the government and come up with some solutions. They have to address a series of questions. The ones I've highlighted in black here are about implications of the tilt change for the length of the year, the length of the day, whether the seasons will change, what the new climate will be like. And then there's one at the end, which is how are these changes going to affect food sources, energy use, travel, our calendar, international trade, those sorts of things. So to quickly analyse this task, we start in the Roman code. She's using content from outside the curriculum. It's like newsflash, like analogies, ice cube on a hot pavement, the idea of a government report. She's using this outside stuff, this is not in the curriculum, for the purpose of learning science. So Roman code. She shifts into the sovereign code for those questions about scientific content to make conclusions about topics that are in the curriculum, lengths of year, lengths of day, and that sort of stuff that they are going to be tested on. And she ends in the Trojan code, asking them to take that science content for purposes beyond the curriculum, discussing implications for issues about things like international trade. 6 presentations were given by 6 groups. I'm going to choose 3 very quickly to show that the teacher reacted to very, very differently. The first group began with lots of content from outside the curriculum for humour, lots of stuff, including a quote from Another Brick in the Wall by Pink Floyd. They begin in exotic code. They did a hard reset by saying, but first, let's address these questions. So this is, by the way, I should say, these are kids at the front doing a presentation, okay? And they talked in the sovereign code, answering the questions on the top half of the slide about the length of the year and the days. But during this, they repeatedly flipped over into the exotic code to make jokes, such as their suggested solution of putting a freezer around the entire South Pole full of Pepsi so that we can shout drinks for the whole world after the incident has been rectified. So they keep flipping over into the exotic code to use non-scientific content for humorous purposes. And they kept switching back and forward between the sovereign and the exotic codes until finally they kind of get stuck in the exotic code, and the presentation sort of ends with a list of supposed implications for trade that talks about ISIS and talked about the film Rocky and all this sort of stuff. So this particular group flip-flopped between 2 codes that didn't really weave together. Science for science and then humour for humour. And this is a key point, because without using the Trojan code, they weren't using science for another purpose. And without the Roman code, they weren't turning other content to science use. They were only using the sovereign and exotic. They were going inside and outside, but they weren't really weaving them together. And they ended up stuck in the exotic, making jokes. The teacher thought this was highly entertaining, but criticised their discussion of implications. She highlighted, in other words, their missing Trojan code, the lack of the use of the science content for the purpose of explaining implications. Another group only answered the questions from the slide. They didn't pretend to be scientists reporting to a government. They launched straight into giving answers, such as the length of year will not change because Earth will stay in the same orbit. In other words, sovereign code questions got sovereign code replies, and the same for the Trojan code questions about implications. They discussed exactly what those changes meant for floods affecting trade and ability to grow food and so on. Teacher said that's fine, wasn't very particularly impressed. She says good, very good, but she didn't laugh or clap or respond to it in any way as much as some of the other presentations, because, to be honest, it was dull. It didn't include anything below the line. Nothing from outside what they'd already done, pretty much. The final example, though, began in the Roman code. They introduced themselves to the government as if they were scientists, and they turned the content from beyond the curriculum towards doing this task. Dear government, we've been recently made aware, this is them, of the worldwide crisis involving the melting of the South Pole, causing drastic changes to the Earth's tilt. Since this could be catastrophic, we've come up with some ideas we thought life would be like with these changes and how to deal with them. And then they answered all the questions about the year, length of the year and the seasons and so on. Then they addressed the questions about the implications for food sources, international trade, energy and so on, turning that science to another purpose. And then finally, having done that, which was the task, they made some jokes about iPhones and the former Prime Minister of Australia using non-scientific content for humour, exotic code. Teacher loved this, absolutely loved it. She was laughing, she was clapping, she praised it highly. Why? Well, we'd suggest that one reason might be because it matched the code shifts of the task. They trace out the same autonomy pathway. At least the first three, the 1 to 2 to 3 does, and then having done that, they have a bit of fun in the exotic code. At the same time, they also show they can do a full circuit as well. Now, this requires, this conjecture, a lot more research, but it does suggest that particular pathways may be required for success at particular moments. And we'd suggest, based on our preliminary analyses, that these pathways differ depending upon the subject and the task and the year of study and so on. And also what's significant is that we can track autonomy. We can analyse what pathways are required for success, say through an essay or an assignment or something, and we can teach the students how to recognise those pathways and how to succeed. We can show them at least one rule of the game using these tools, not all of them. So to conclude, what I've been arguing is twofold. First, that a key attribute of knowledge, building with different forms of knowledge, may be found in autonomy tours. You need to travel, you need to embrace different kinds of knowledge and ways of working, but you need to return home to your target content, your target purpose. You need to bring it all back home, whatever you define as your target. That seems obvious, like just about everything I've ever written, but as we're finding, it's often missed in classrooms, and it's often missed in research too. I mean, too often scholars flip from one kind of knowledge to another without bringing them into fruitful relationships. They flip-flop between sovereign code of their own knowledge, their own disciplinary knowledge, and exotic code of another kind. They don't use the Trojan code to turn their knowledge to other uses. They don't use the Roman code to translate other knowledge into their own ways of working. So these things may be sitting side by side, but they're not being brought into fruitful relations. They're two pandas sitting in the cage just staring at each other. For example, multidisciplinary research can often, and you can see this in edited collections, can often comprise a series of separate studies that do not come together. So it's not enough to say that we should relate everyday and academic knowledge, or we should relate different disciplines together, or we should integrate workplace skills or academic literacy or technology into classrooms. I think we need tools like autonomy codes to analyse what that might entail and to show when it's working or not. For example, we're currently looking in our research at how technology is integrated and to what purpose. My second point is related. We can use these concepts to track the pathways of practices. We can show what success means in any specific context, and then we can teach those pathways to newcomers, such as students. We can reveal the rules of the game, which could have significant impact on social justice issues and education. Before I finish, I want to clarify 2 points of what I'm not saying. I'm not arguing for traditional disciplines. In our examples, the sovereign code involved these well-established disciplines because we're looking at secondary school in New South Wales and Australia, and the teachers there defined their subjects as their target knowledge, their target purpose. But your targets in your research or your practice could be anything. It could be political indoctrination with orthodox Marxism. It could be a space for sharing personal experiences with others. So we're not arguing for or against any particular content or any particular purposes. It's up to you or your participants to define those things. And the second point is related. Saying that we can use these concepts to teach students to succeed the rules of the game is not trying to fit them to a status quo. That is absolute and utter nonsense as far as I'm concerned. It's only by revealing the rules of the game that we can consciously master and change the rules of the game instead of being unconsciously subject to them. What we don't know can hurt us, and it hurts us over and over and over again. And again, it's up to participants to define the pathways that they see as successful. I'm not standing up here and saying what it is that people are supposed to be doing. None of us on the project are. So, finishing off, returning to what I am arguing, I've illustrated how LCT can see knowledge as an object, but it's more than that. It offers more than types that don't fit complex empirical data. It explores the organising principles and practices like other dimensions of LCT. It's not locked into any particular object of study. As I said, we tried it out on, I really hope we write that up, the comedy sketch. And it works. It does explain why it's funny. And it can be used on anything. That's really important if we want to build knowledge ourselves instead of proliferating more and more little microfields and little bags of tricks. If we want to speak to each other, whatever our topic, because we are more than the sum of our parts, I believe. And we can also, unlike types, track change over time, which is crucial if you're talking about building knowledge. I'm not saying these ideas cover everything. This is only one dimension of LCT. This is one set of tools. It does one job. But we can use it with others. I've already gone over time, so I'm not going to say how you can use it. I'm just going to tease people who know LCT by saying, look, you can use it with semantic waves. Oh, look at that. They're two totally different semantic waves with autonomy codes on them. They explain different things even though they're the same wave. I'm not going to say what that means unless pressed to afterwards. I haven't got time. But either way, I'm saying that autonomy isn't everything, but it does provide insight into a crucial set of attributes for building knowledge and teaching students how to succeed. And that's something I think is worth engaging with and bringing back home wherever you come from. Thank you.